Brent here with BYOTools, and on today's Yours to Make tutorial presented by Dickies, we are making coasters out of scrap plywood. So if you want to learn how to do it, keep on watching. Let's get started. So I had an old piece of apple ply that I really didn't know what to do with, and I wanted to see what we can make out of it because 'tis the season for gift giving. So let's get this bad boy cut up. There are plenty of different types of plywood that you can use for this project, but this plywood is apple ply. It's extremely thick, dense, and very straight, which is exactly what we want for this application. I first go about cutting a smaller, manageable chunk to bring to my table saw because this stuff is so dense, it's actually quite heavy. Obviously due to the fact that it's 1 inch thick, as well as the fact that we have 18 layers in this one piece of plywood. Pretty impressive. That large blue thing, if you don't know already, is actually a featherboard, and it basically acts as a third hand because it provides pressure against the fence of the table saw. It reduces wobble when I'm pushing the wood through the table saw and allows me to focus more on the cutting, which is always important. Each piece of wood that I'm cutting is approximately 1/2 inch thick, and I did have quite a bit of chip out, so before I cut these even further, I want to make sure I sand those off with my oscillating spindle sander. If you don't have one of these, go ahead and use just your standard sander, which is just fine, just might take a little bit longer. Once I have all the edges sanded down, I then proceed to moving over to our chop saw. I actually create a stop block because I want all of these cuts to be very precise and the same exact measurement, and I don't want to go back and forth on taking my tape measure on every single one. This makes it a lot easier and a lot quicker to make numerous cuts at the same exact size. At this point in time, I want to make a mitered edge style coaster as well. So I actually set my angle to 45 degrees on my chop saw, and that way I get a completely different look to my coasters by just changing the angle of the cut. Now, we can make numerous different things with this type of material, but I think especially for gift giving, it's a perfect product to make coasters out of. And I've cut 2 different styles. This one is obviously square, which is going to be a square version. This is a mitered version, or a mitered edge. So it's going to have a bit of a unique feel and look to each type of coaster. But first things first, we got to start gluing. So let's get to gluing. I took a bit of plastic wrap that's actually meant to protect carpet in a construction area, place that on a board of melamine, and that's my basis to work off of. Now, these large blue things are actually from Rockler, and they're positioning squares mainly used for setting cabinetry corners because it provides a perfect 90-degree edge, or in this case, our 245 degrees. I set them in place with a couple screws on top and then proceed to gluing. Plenty of glue on this project. There are obviously copious amounts of glues to choose from, but on this project I'm using Titebond 2, which is normally my go-to for any type of woodworking glue up. I'm obviously doing the mitered edge version first, and I basically dunk one end and one side in the glue and then press both of them together. Then basically do the same exact thing over and over again. If you're using a lot of glue, you really only need to apply it to one side at a time and you don't have to apply it to both sides. So just keep that in mind as you're proceeding to gluing all of these pieces together. Now, the only difficult thing about the glue up is to make sure you have as minimal of a gap between each board as humanly possible. I've personally decided not to use any clamps on this project because I want a finesse angle on each specific location, and therefore making sure I have the necessary angle that I want is key with every single piece. I do snug up a secondary side rail in order to have a cohesive edge that runs all the way across, and that does provide a bit more support for the entire unit. As we proceed with the second square pattern, it's basically the same concept. Go ahead and apply glue to the top and one of the sides, then stick them together and proceed with doing it over and over again. Now, in all honesty, I found this version was actually a bit more difficult to align perfectly than the mitered edge. With that being said, all I need to do is apply a bit of filler, which is just some sawdust from the wood itself, along with plenty of glue. Obviously, in some of these locations, I'm a bit nitpicky, but I do want to have as much of a perfect seam as possible as I proceed to sanding and finishing these pieces. I let these units dry for approximately 24 hours and then release them from the form. Since I installed that plastic on the bottom, it was extremely easy to remove both of these units just by using a 6-inch putty knife to get underneath them. At this point in time, we are now ready for sanding. I'm taking my Bosch sander, which actually has a turbo mode, and I use 60 grit sandpaper to remove all the excess glue up from both boards. You obviously have to be mindful of making sure that the actual surface is completely flat, and as you can see, it looks quite beautiful. At this point, you're not only trying to remove all of the excess glue, but you also need to be mindful of if there's any elevation differences between each board, which there might be slight changes, but luckily for us, we have a powerful sander to take care of all those variations. Because come on, no one likes a wobbly coaster, right? No. At this point in time, I just had to take a moment to realize, look how beautiful that edge looks, and it's going to be an awesome pattern for a coaster. But let's get it into a coaster shape. I take my level and apply a line down the end in order to accommodate where I'm going to have some cutoff of material to accommodate a properly sized coaster. So these boards are fully sanded down, and now I want to cut all this miscellaneous material that I'm not going to be using later on. So I took my level, took a couple clamps, made a nice perfect straight edge so I can utilize this in order to utilize my actual circular saw to have a nice perfect cut all the way down. So let's start cutting. Note that this skill saw cut is just for one side on each board because I then can take it to my table saw and cut both ends evenly because I have a straight side that I can rest up against my table saw fence. And just like any project that I work on, number one priority is safety, so making sure you have some type of push stick, especially in these tight-knit locations, is key, as you can see right there. We have our sides cleaned up, and now I'm going to cut each coaster to the appropriate size. Just make sure they are actually square if you want them square. I use my chop saw and my stop block for this to ensure that I have the same exact length and size that I want on each specific coaster. I also wanted to provide two different sizes of coasters, which is why the mitered size actually is a 4x4 and the square block coaster is actually a 5x5. Let me know in the comments which size you like more. At this point in time, we have all of our coasters fully cut up, and I must say I'm loving all three of these styles. Yes, we have the mitered style, we have the square style. I even use the mitered style, but I actually cut them in half to make them kind of a cool, unique shape. So very unique pieces, but I actually wanted to put a little more character into these, which is why I have my router table, which I'm going to be routing all these edges with a roundover bit just to have a nice crisp edge on one side. So let's get to it. I personally love a roundover bit because not only is it extremely easy to use and utilize on a wood project, but it actually also transforms your woodworking into something that looks much more professional. You wouldn't think it until you really saw it, and it's so easy to use. I would highly recommend anyone that wants to take on projects like this or any other woodworking endeavors. The white table that you see here is also quite important for this project because of the fact we're working with such small pieces of wood. You want a very stable working environment to work off of, and therefore it's a lot easier to do it like this than to try and use your router in your hand while routing all of these edges, which does take some time and energy. Now, because we have a lot of small pieces of wood, I wanted to have a secure sander. and that's why I used a tie down strap to actually tie down my sander to a working surface and then hand sand each piece individually. This makes it actually a lot easier to control all the edges, especially for all of our finishing sanding that we're going to be doing here. I'm using 200 grit sandpaper to not only get the top and bottom, but all of the edges perfectly smooth. And as you can see here, because of the rounded over edges, you're easily able to maneuver the coasters evenly and consistently on all four corners, so you have a perfectly smooth coaster. And something about a perfectly smooth surface on wood is always satisfying in my personal opinion.
Now that we have all of our coasters sanded down perfectly, I want to give it a little BYOT love. And with that, I'm going to use this brand from Gearhart Industries, which is now close to 300 degrees. Yeah, pretty hot. We're going to do that before we finish, just to give it a little bit of extra character. Let's do it.
This is a custom brand that I had made up, and the best thing about this brand is that all you have to do is plug it in. You don't have to use a blowtorch to try and heat it up to a perfect temperature and then continuously add more heat when you're doing more and more of these coasters. It's the perfect temperature throughout the entire process, which is always valuable.
Now, as for finishing these coasters, we are using walrus oil furniture finish, and no, there were no walruses hurt during the making of this finish. It's actually all 100% plant-based, and it's a perfect finish for this type of application.
And one of the best parts about this finish is the easeability of use. All I did was take an empty container, pour in some of the solution, and then basically hand dipped every single one into that solution, submerged it for a couple seconds, removed it, and actually let them set overnight. This finish truly shows off the beauty of the wood, and the nice thing about letting it sit overnight is that it just soaks in all of that excess finish and makes the coasters more durable in the long run. The next morning I grabbed my coasters, and as you can see, they look absolutely beautiful. I just need to make sure that I'm wiping off all the excess finish that may be on there. And at this point, it's our final step, applying the feet. That is the plastic or padded feet for these coasters. Now there's two different styles that I apply to these coasters depending on what you like, because the plastic ones have a very nice firm grip, and once you put a drink on them, they're not going anywhere. But the felt pads are really nice because they're smooth and they can glide across the table without damaging it very easily, which you'll see soon enough. But guess what? After I have these installed, we are done. Really love how these coasters turned out, and the best part about it is that it came from scrap pieces of wood that I could have very well just thrown out. It's something that really adds a beautiful character, and as you can see, is one beautiful sexy beast. But before we send these beautiful homemade coasters out as gifts, we gotta test them out, right? I mean, I am feeling a little parched after talking so much today, and there was a lot of dust created with these coasters. But wait. Did I forget something? No! Sorry, I just had to.
Close one.